Welcome to topic 1.1, Developments in East Asia. This is your first video lecture for AP World History. Yay! I'm Miss Brennan, and let's get this show on the road. We're going to start with some background information, specifically looking at the Zhou period. The Zhou are the ones who actually introduced the concept of the mandate of heaven, meaning when the emperor is ruling in the best interest of his people, the gods will keep his family in power as long as they remain in the favor of the gods. Thus, when bad things start to happen, when natural calamities happen, when wars happen, famine, this means the emperor has lost the mandate of heaven and therefore can be overthrown. And the Zhou invoked this as a way to justify their rule when they overthrew the Shang. The Zhou dynasty is divided into two periods, the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou. And you'll notice the two different capitals as well. And typically, when an empire has to relocate their capital, that's a sign that things are not going well for them. And typically, that's one of the major things to look for when your dynasty is on the brink of collapse. We'll see this with the Zhou, we'll see this with the Roman Empire. We're going to see it happen a few times throughout history. And the Eastern Zhou was characterized by a decline in the strength of the central government. Regional elites began to rule their territories as independent states, and then fighting led to a gradual consolidation into smaller, more powerful kingdoms. The Eastern Zhou itself is actually divided into two periods, the Spring and Autumn period, and the Warring States period. It's exactly what it sounds like. The names are taken from contemporary historical documents which describe the two periods. And it's very important that we remember the Warring States period. We are going to come back to that. Let's talk about religion. Confucianism, Daoism, and Chinese society. Confucianism and Daoism had their roots because of the chaos of the late Zhou period. Confucianism was founded by Confucius, and it assumes that human nature is essentially good. There's a hierarchical view of the universe, society, and the family, and the concern is with establishing moral foundations of government. Good government equals good people. Confucius was not actually influential in his own time, but later on it would become the dominant political philosophy of imperial China. Daoism is said to have been founded by Lao-tzu. It assumes that the universe is in a constant flux, there are no absolute moral standards, and people should just take the world as they find it. And it developed into a very complex system of popular beliefs, and many Chinese drew on both traditions, even though Daoism and Confucianism appeared at odds with each other. In society of the Eastern Zhou, there was the development of the three-generation family unit, and then the development of the concept of private property, including privately owned land. And due to the Confucian hierarchy, women were more firmly subordinated in a patriarchal system. Their subordinate position was justified by the concepts of the yin and the yang. Another religion and school of thought that would emerge during this time period was Buddhism. And the teachings of Buddhism followed the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. Buddhism identified two incorrect routes to enlightenment. One was extreme self-mortification, and the other extreme self-indulgence. The Eightfold Path was meant to escape the endless cycle of rebirth, and the Four Noble Truths focused on suffering is real. Second truth is the origin of suffering. The third is that suffering could be ended, and the fourth was the Eightfold Path ended suffering. And the Eightfold Path consisted of right understanding, resolve, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and meditation. And following this path led to nirvana, the end of the cycle of rebirth. Nirvana means extinction, but it also means true understanding. The Buddha urged everyone to follow him, to live a simple life. He believed that only monks like him could achieve nirvana, and people who did not become monks but did good works, who donated food and money, could achieve merit. The Buddha forbade any worship of statues or portraits of him. He did allow worship at four sites important to his life, where he was born, where he gained enlightenment, where he preached his first sermon, and ultimately where he died. By 600, there would actually be 3 different types of Buddhist monasteries in China. And we'll talk about what those are in a little bit. The long reign of the Han. So the Han Dynasty is one of the most famous dynasties in Chinese history. Partly because this dynasty was formed after hundreds of years of chaos, of disresolve, and the Han would actually establish a political system that drew on Confucian philosophy and legalist techniques. They rose after the fall of the very short-lived Qin dynasty. This is where the foundation of the Great Wall would begin. Han rulers faced a lot of challenges at first, mostly because there was still a lot of resentment toward the government. The Qin dynasty was quite ruthless. Shi Huangdi, he was the founder, heavily taxed and forced people to build the Great Wall of China. To ease the transition and then to help the economy, the Han actually reduced taxes and government spending, and they collected and stored surplus grain for times of shortage. During Emperor Wu's reign, the expansion of Chinese territory into the northwest and the foundation of the Silk Road would actually improve the economic health of China. To pay for this, though, for this military buildup for these roads, Wu would introduce some very controversial government monopolies on high-profit commodities that everyone needed to buy, specifically salt and iron. And the state adopted Confucianism. They used Confucian scholars as officials of the government, and they in turn expected exemplary ethical behavior from their rulers. So I just wanted to show you this, guys. This is the Qin Dynasty. If you've ever heard of the Terracotta Army, that is this right here. It was found in Shi Huangdi's tomb. And this is a map of Han territory. Within Chinese society, the family was the basic unit, guys. The family was conceived as an unbroken chain of generations, and that included ancestors and ancestor veneration, as well as the current generations. Relative to technological innovations, the Han era saw the development of the watermill, a usable horse collar, paper, horse breeding to have superior horses for the cavalry, and a reliable crossbow trigger. And guys, if you're going to be riding horses while you are shooting arrows, you're going to want to have a reliable weapon. Chinese society believed that a hierarchy in the family, which was dominated by the elder male, reflected the hierarchy in society, which was dominated by male rulers. The status and authority of women was dependent upon their social status. Women in the royal family could have some influence, but women were expected to be obedient, not just to their fathers and their husbands, but also their mothers-in-laws, and then eventually their sons. So what I want you to do is just pause for a minute and take over the slide. Just pause it, look it over, guys. Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism, you need to know the differences. So feel free to pause. Eventually, the Han would collapse from invasions, as well as political unrest. And after a few hundred years, in 580, the Sui dynasty would rise. And what the Sui are most known for is they restored the Chinese imperial structure. They reestablished Confucian rites, Confucian law, and rituals. They defeated their enemies, but they were a patron of the arts. But their greatest accomplishment is this. This is called the Grand Canal, and it was a way to send goods from north to south, but it was also a way for communication. The problem is, guys, public works projects are very expensive. To pay for them, taxes go up. And thus, they were overthrown. The moral of this story, everybody, is raising taxes makes people very upset. And this happened again and again and again. And what we would see, even with Shi Huangdi, he was a very bloodthirsty ruler, but it was raising the taxes. that cause people to rebel. What we're looking at, guys, is people essentially going for broke and losing everything to pay for the Grand Canal or to pay for the terracotta army, the monumental architecture. So the Tang overthrow the Sui, and much like the Sui, they focus on expanding Confucian administrative systems. They are the ones who established bureaucracy, as you can see right here. They legitimized their control, though, by also incorporating Buddhism. And these monasteries were a very important ally of the early Tang emperors. And in return for their assistance, they received tax exemption, land, and gifts. And Mahayana Buddhism would become the most important school of Buddhism in East Asia. The expansion westward of the Tang Empire improved its commercial and intellectual reach, and it also brought Buddhism much more deeply into Asia. It made the Tang Dynasty a truly cosmopolitan empire, with one of the cities, Chang'an, being the cultural center of the Eastern world. The Tang were very liberal towards all religions, specifically Empress Wu. Empress Wu was actually the only woman to rule in her own right in China. She was a patron of Buddhism. She paid for a number of monasteries to be built. And Buddhism, as well as Empress Wu, legitimized women's participation in politics. But this would ultimately lead to a crackdown on the Buddhist monasteries. When Empress Wu abdicated due to old age, she was in her mid-80s, that's when the government actually began destroying the Buddhist monasteries. And Confucian ideology was reasserted. During the Tang, there were a number of cultural improvements. One of the things, guys, was going to be champa rice. So champa rice was imported, and the Tang actually then began to build what's called terrace farming, and they were able to grow even more of this rice. This would lead to a massive population boom, as well as an increase in the number of cities that were being built. In turn, it revived the Silk Road, and the Tang became contemporaries of the Umayyad and the Abbasid caliphates. We'll talk about them in our next podcast. We'll see the power move from north to south. But when the Tang collapsed, again, there was a crackdown on the monasteries, the Song Dynasty would rise. And during the Song period, the Chinese made a number of technological innovations, many of them based on information that had been brought to China from West Asia along the Silk Road, thanks to the Tang Dynasty. And a lot of this had to do with math, astronomy, and calendar making. The Song inventors improved an earlier Chinese innovation, the magnetic compass, and they made it suitable for seafaring by the end of the 11th century. They also weaponized gunpowder. They improved foreign trade because of a new ship called the junk, and we would also see the rise of Neo-Confucianism. The Song had a standing, professionally trained, and regularly paid military. Iron became incredibly important, and it was used, along with steel, for weapons, armor, and defensive works. We would see a lot of specialized production. So guys, the Song were never politically powerful, but they were geniuses when it came to technology and when it came to creating goods. We'll see government monopolies, private businesses, and guilds. They would create beautiful silk, porcelain, and iron weapons. And the Song actually took a technology made in Korea, block printing, and they created the first movable type. And that allowed them to mass produce certain texts for the exam system. In Confucianism, to get into the government, there's a very, very detailed exam one must take. It was a civil service exam, and people studied for years for this test. During the Song period, the population rose to 100 million. Because the markets were expanding so quickly, the Song would also introduce the first interregional credit system called flying money, and they introduced paper money. So that $5 bill that you have in your pocket right now, you can thank the Song Dynasty for that. Unfortunately, the money caused inflation and was later withdrawn because there was no system backing it up. But it was the first inter-regional credit system, guys. You could take that money and go somewhere outside Song territory, and people recognized and accepted it. Unfortunately, the Song was not able to control the market economy as previous governments had done, and this would lead to certain fluctuations in taxes, and ultimately we would see the economy begin to crumble. During the Song period, we would also see women's status decline as Buddhism was cracked down on and Confucianism rose back. Nobody is quite sure if it's during the late Tang or the early Song. We would also see the rise of foot binding. Women became completely subordinate to men. They were not able to own property. Remarrying, if a spouse died, was forbidden for women, but not for men. Again, what we would see, though, is gunpowder, new porcelain techniques, including translucent porcelain. Because of movable type, mass production of the classics. And again, flying money, naval technology, improved boats, iron smelting, improved weapons and armor. One thing we'll also see is the rise of Korea and Vietnam. So in Korea, the hereditary elite absorbed Confucian and Buddhist ideas from China and passed them along to Japan. There were several small Korean kingdoms, and they were first united by Silla in 668, and then by the Koryo in the early 900s CE. Korea used woodblock printing as early as the 700s and later invented movable type, which then passed to the Song China with the movable frame. In Vietnam, what we know is the geography was very similar in terms of what could be grown to that in China, which is why the rice that China would adopt, the champa rice, grew so well. We know that there was economic and cultural assimilation that took place in Vietnam during the Tang and Song times, specifically in northern Vietnam, which was called Annam. They modeled their high culture on that from the Chinese. And when the Tang Empire fell, Annam established itself as a very powerful independent state under the name Davet. In southern Vietnam, the Kingdom of Champa was influenced by Malay and India, as well as some Chinese culture. And during the Song period, Champa cultivated a relationship with the Song state, and again, this is how that rice was exported to China. East Asian countries would share a common Confucian interest and hierarchy, particularly when it came to the government and how the government functioned. And finally, the Heian period of Japan. In the mid-7th century, the rulers of Japan implemented a series of political reforms to establish a centralized government, legal codes, national histories, architecture, and city planning based on the model of Tang China. The native religion was Shinto, and it did survive along with the religion of Buddhism. Women in this period had two very different roles. So women of the aristocracy became royal consorts, and they linked the court with their own kinsmen. During the Heian period, the Fujiwara clan would dominate the Japanese government. They were known as the shogunates. This period in Japan covered roughly 790 to 1185, 1190 CE. And it would see a flourish in Japanese culture, from literature to paintings. The Fujiwara clan would dominate the government and its administration. But what we know is that women who were in the Fujiwara clan and women who were in the imperial court of the emperor, because there is an emperor, but he's more seen as a figurehead with some power. The real power is the shogunate. Women who were in the imperial court actually lived very free lives. They lived very public lives, and this is shown to us in the Pillow Book. And what we know because of this is that, contradictory to the Fujiwara women, they were able to live alongside and interact with anyone they pleased. Fujiwara women were very isolated, and they were kept within the home. And after the fall of the Fujiwara, we would see the rise of the Kamakura shogunate. And we'll talk more about them as we continue on with our lectures. So if you have any questions, send me an email. I know this was a lot, but a lot of information to cover, a lot of very important, fun things. Have a great night, guys.